Hey everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science podcast. I'm Jamie, and it's great to be recording today. I'm here as always with co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
Hey James, how's it going? Very good, thank you.
Yeah, today we're particularly excited because our guest is Michelle Cassandra Johnson. Um, Michelle is an activist and a quote social justice warrior, author, anti-racism consultant and trainer, intuitive healer, and yoga teacher and practitioner. She's worked in a huge range of contemplative spaces, and we're extremely excited to have her. Michelle, how are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be a guest on your show.
No, it's honestly brilliant to have you. And I wanted to start by talking about trauma. Something that as a human experience is always kind of relevant, but I think has probably been more relevant recently than perhaps ever before. Um, and I want to ask about the relationship between spiritual practice and trauma. But before I do, I want to make this distinction. You sometimes touch on the distinction between individual and collective trauma. And I wanted to know that what in your mind the difference was.
Yeah, so in general, I think about trauma as something that disrupts the nervous system and throws us off balance. Um, Kind of the way that I talk about it, and that we can move out of balance mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally. And what I understand about trauma individually and collectively is that the nervous system and our nervous systems are in communication. The nervous system is trying to resolve that trauma in some way. And sometimes we'll replay the sensations and emotions connected with the traumatic experience over and over as a way to try to resolve it. And I think we see this collectively in patterns that people are playing out. But also, I was a therapist for a long time and saw this with individuals who'd experienced either one experience of trauma, an incident of trauma, or ongoing trauma. And I also want to say, I think we live in my experience, the world is fairly traumatic because of what people do to each other and the conditions we're sort of living in, these times we're moving through, and patterns of oppression and harm. And I'm also clear that the trauma that I embody can lead me to create more trauma for others and the planet. So to me, they feel completely connected. If I think about my individual experience of trauma related to abandonment of my father, who left when I was a child, for example, that has certainly affected me in many, many ways. And it doesn't feel separate from the ancestral trauma that he likely embodied from his ancestors having been enslaved. And then that pattern of abandonment, or that pattern of trying to resolve his own trauma, and being a Black man, right? And so I just think they're all, like, I have these individual experiences of trauma, but I think they're all connected to the collective in some way because we're all connected. I think I wanted to elevate a conversation about collective grief and collective trauma because in spiritual spaces, what I've heard a lot of is people focusing on individual trauma-informed practice as if we're not having a collective experience of trauma. We can look at COVID as a collective experience of trauma and loss, and it isn't over. And we don't really understand how we'll be impacted by this. We don't know enough about it psychologically, the psychological impacts of COVID, and of course the other sort of global pandemics and uprisings that happened in the middle of COVID. I just assume everyone is moving with trauma in some way, be that individual or the way that we are harming each other, and the collective trauma that comes from that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but they feel so linked to me.
No, it makes sense. And I mean, there's two things in there particularly. The first is, and I've played the same game, when you can identify the specific trauma individually you're working with or have been working with traditionally, you come to the whole conversation slightly differently because you have the context, right? You have the context of having experienced the trauma, and you can see, well, this has been running the show in various ways in terms of my behavior. And then you can see exactly how that extrapolates to the collective trauma. And I'm interested to hear you say that there's a feedback mechanism. So when, as a therapist, you were working with individuals, you would see them, if I caught that correctly, replaying the thing over. Do you perceive that to be the psyche attempting to get to grips with what happened?
Yes, I think it's in an effort. I think people are trying to heal. Their nervous system is trying to work out the trauma and heal. And as a therapist, modality that I use the most when responding to trauma it's a terrible name, I think, but it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's EMDR. I love the technique. And it is a way to unlock the nervous system. This is the idea behind it, so that people can actually replay the trauma and resolve it. Without that support, be it EMDR or something else, I think it's challenging for people because myself included, I may not understand what's happening. Like if I am reminded of, if I see someone who reminds me of a person that has caused harm or that is connected to a traumatic experience, and I all of a sudden feel nauseous, I may not understand that's rooted in the trauma, or that there's even a connection between the person that I'm seeing and that's reminding me of the trauma I moved through. Like I may not consciously understand that, but my nervous system does. And I think many people have this, like when we have this feeling of holding the breath, or we feel something in our gut or intuition and we're not sure why, or we behave in a way that is sort of unexplainable to us. I think a lot of times that can be rooted in trauma, and not just the trauma we've lived through in this lifetime, but I think ancestral trauma too, the trauma that we carry in our bodies. So I think it is in the spirit of healing. I just don't know that everyone has the tools to do that as they're trying to like make sense of, why am I reacting this way and responding this way, and why am I starting an argument with this person, why am I reacting in a way that doesn't match the situation. I think that is trauma, and we just don't know, and we may not have the language to describe it, or the resources, meaning support services and resources, to help us understand what we've been through and what's happening.
Really resonate a lot with what you've just said. One thing that I especially appreciate is this idea that we're trying to be healthy, we're trying to be well. The system itself wants to be well. That's what we're built for. The system wants to try to find a way to be well. It just doesn't know how to be well, or the sort of models it has of itself in the world aren't updated to a certain degree where it can get to being well. So then is that the role as you see it for various sort of contemplative traditions and practices? These are ways of helping people build better skills and abilities so that their natural wanting to be well can happen.
Yes, I love this question and connection, because how I understand spiritual practice is that it is many things, and one thing that it is to support us in reconnecting with our true nature, which yoga and spiritual practice would say is spirit, is God, is divine. We have different words to describe this, but all of it is about being a divine being on this planet at this time, and in relationship with every being, and everything that has happened before is happening now and will happen in the future. And so if that's the like premise of the practice, right, I think it definitely invites us through different, I'm thinking about yoga and the 8 limb path. So through meditation, through deep breathing and retraining the nervous system, right, and helping it move back into balance, understanding the connection between the brain and the nervous system, and the breath, and the breath's ability to shift the mind and how we think, and to notice patterns, right, to interrupt those patterns, to look at the ways we're suffering and understand what that's rooted in and why the origin of suffering, and to try to mitigate some of that. To be in a consistent practice, right? A sadhana, to be in a consistent practice, be that meditation or journaling or pranayama breath practice or movement. And really with yoga, we want to try to practice all of the limbs of the 8 limb path. So I do think it is an ancient wisdom tradition that can support us in moving back into balance, because the whole idea is that we are or at one point we're in balance with each other. We were attuned to each other and our needs, right? And our connection, our interconnectedness. So this is what I believe about the practice and the power of it to bring us back amid so many oppressive systems that want us to be distracted and fragmented and think we're separate and individuals, and that what we do on any given day at any given moment doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect other people, when in fact everything we do affects everyone, not just humans.
There's something to be said here too about the collective trauma. I used to think of this as a bit of a metaphor, as opposed to an actual system of no, there's an ancestral element, and things are passed on perhaps mechanically. I'm speaking as a fairly secular Jewish person, and I've had on and off Holocaust nightmares forever. with pre really having any knowledge of the Holocaust or any particularly scarring experiences, there's been a level of I've walked around with that on some level forever. And I wonder if that's the kind of thing you mean when you say ancestral trauma, the type you sort of carry it around even without obvious experience.
Yes. And I think some of this depends on how much we know about history and our lineage. But even so, I think we're wise, and our bodies know, and our bodies remember, and will act out in response to ancestral trauma, and things will be revealed, like through dreams, right? Or someone says something and it triggers something in us, and it's connected to an ancestral trauma. So I think it, and of course, there's been research done on this now. I think we knew this, like ancestral trauma was passed on, especially if it wasn't resolved and people couldn't heal it, like that trauma gets passed on. And now there's a ton of research to support that. And so I think about myself and like the enslavement of my people, and the I don't know much about where I'm from. And that wound is deep, right? And my mother doesn't know much about where she's from beyond my great grandmother. So beyond her grandmother, my mother's grandmother. And what does it mean to move in the world and not really feel rooted, physically, emotionally, energetically, geographically? Like, this isn't the land I'm from. And it's hard for me to trace. I've done some tracing of that, but I don't really know. And so I think that kind of loss, and that's not just mine, that's my father, his father, my mother, her mother. And that just feels like a wound that is massive. I'm not always conscious of it, but I'm aware in this moment as we're talking about, like, that is deep, to not be able to create a family tree. When I went to school with kids who could do that, like, because I went to a predominantly white school, and the kids there had a lot of money and they could trace back their family trees, and we all had to bring ours in, and I couldn't do that. And I was like 5, right? What does it mean to experience that and try to piece that together and understand we were separated as people, our families were separated, and people were sold. So that kind of, what you said resonates and makes me think about, even if I wasn't there, right? I'm aware of that, and that affects me in so many different ways on many different levels.
It's interesting that you draw this relationship between knowing and trauma, because, there's some good evidence now that one of the things that helps engender trauma, like the nastiness in trauma, because not everything bad that happens to us gets embedded in a way that becomes a kind of trauma. Sometimes it can just be a bad day or a bad moment, and we don't carry it with us. It looks like one of the things that helps that get in the nasty way is that we don't understand something. We don't have the right knowledge about it. So something has happened, and our parents or our culture or society is reflecting back to us, oh man, something bad has happened. And you go out to try to figure it out. I mean, that's probably what a lot of those pathological systems are. It's trying to get some knowledge about what's happened. And then if you're not given the knowledge of it, if nobody's there to tell you, oh, this is why it happened, this is the line that brought you here, without those things, you're abandoned, and you have this heavy duty, hard energy to try to digest. That seems like it's just the sort of right stuff. So I like that about knowledge and trauma. Because I think probably spirituality comes back there as well, right? Because this is, like you had already said, it's knowledge about who you are. And if we don't know who we are, then of course we're missing some of that information. And maybe that's part of what helps these things get engendered in us. I wonder.
Yeah, I love this connection, because in my experience, and I lead a ton of dismantling racism work and sort of racial equity work in spiritual spaces and other spaces. And people have a lot of trouble talking about history. Right. They don't want to talk about it. It is uncomfortable. We don't need to name what happened in the past. We just need to respond to this moment. I'm like, well, everything that happened in the past is pretty much playing itself out now, like the patterns, and we continue to do the same things to each other. So what you named about, if we don't understand it, right? I didn't understand why I couldn't create a family tree. And if my mother had not explained it to me, it still feels like a wound. I may have been completely confused and felt shame about not being able to give a family tree to my teacher. and I did feel some of that. I remember this. I mean, I was very young, but my mom talked to me about it. She's like, we don't know, right? And here's why we don't know. But without her, and I think there are many examples of this where we want to deny and forget and pretend and lie about what happened. And I think to heal, we actually need to be in a conversation about what happened so that we can figure out where we're situated now and then make conscious choices. And actually practice can help us do that and can help us respond to the unraveling that, happens and the way people feel when we unearth and excavate collective trauma is specifically related to systems of oppression, because then we're implicated in some way and we don't necessarily have the tools to talk about it. And that can just disrupt everything for people. So I understand that. And I don't mean to do it haphazardly. I do think we need containers to be in, and I mean spaces where we're intentionally talking about where we are and how we got here and how we feel about it and our confusion and ambivalence and our overwhelm. Like, I think we need space, and practice has supported me through those moments of just sheer overwhelm.
I'm just about at the time where I'm thinking about being a dad, and, thinking about these things from that perspective, you just think like you have so much training to do before you bring a little being into the world, because of all of the unconscious stuff that you can just package them with. If you don't have a good practice and a good position and good mindfulness of why you're acting in the way that you are, like you say, having all these skills to be able to digest the sort of thing that's happening to you, so that it just doesn't get transmitted. It's a big responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. That is yes. I'm not a parent, so I don't feel it from that that space. I do have a young child, a 10-year-old in my life, and I influence her. I'm like, oh, everything I say, she's paying attention to it. So let me be careful. Like, I feel it in that way, right?
Yeah.
How do I want that power of like anything we say, it's going in there. So let's actually be careful about it.
Yeah. Wow. What a strong teacher.
This is a good time to then pick up that spiritual angle more consciously. So in the context of these macro traumas, which are kind of playing out at a high level, and the micro traumas, which are the individual in our life instances, how do we use, and how can listeners particularly use a practice, a yogic practice, to help start addressing those trauma?
Yeah, so the image that popped into my head when you asked the question is something I wrote about in Finding Refuge, which is my second book. In the introduction, of this moment of complete, like I was in pieces on the floor. This is what I will say. It was in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman for murdering Trayvon Martin. And I was cracking open, like I could witness myself. I was afraid. I'd never felt that way. It felt like ancestral trauma, the world's trauma. It felt like trauma for all of the Black women I knew who were pregnant at the time. Like, it was really massive. And I didn't know how I was going to heal. I just didn't know. And my practice knew, is what I want to say, because I continued to breathe. And the next day I didn't go to work because I couldn't get out of bed. And I had a consistent meditation practice. And, I had resistance to sitting still because I was so agitated and activated. Yeah. But my practice really didn't give me another choice. It was just like, you need to sit and breathe and be. And when you feel the sorrow and the despair rise up, take another deep breath, right? And so I think, and I have a movement and asana practice too, and a pranayama practice and self-study, all of those things, and had teachers as well who could support me. I just name that because we may not, I think our practice is wise if we have one or are going to engage in a consistent practice, and that it has the awareness and wisdom to like kick in or step in, right? Or invite us in when we feel overwhelmed. Because the nervous system is connected to the breath, being like, take a deep breath, Michelle, keep breathing, even when you don't feel like you can breathe. So I would say for people, and I had a meditation practice that was daily, but short. It was 5 to 10 minutes on my cushion in the morning. I get out of bed, sit on the cushion. Sometimes people become overwhelmed with practice because they think they need to meditate for 60 minutes. They need to go to a 60-minute asana movement class. They need to study the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, which I would recommend. And we can't do all of those things at the same time. It's, I think, unless that's our path, we're devoted to that, we're not doing other things, we don't have other responsibilities. But many of us have a lot of responsibilities. And so I would say for people to start with one thing, and to start with 5 minutes or 10 minutes to see how that lands for them. To trust that the practice, meditation and breath work and movement, that they are affecting us in some way, even if it's not visible to us, or it's not tangible. And the way we'll know that is when we're in a moment when we really need it and it kicks in, like the one I described. Right, that was from years of practice. So I would say start small, practice, trust it, give it some time, and then we can add on to that. Maybe it's 15 minutes of meditation, or maybe it is going to a movement class or moving in our space intuitively, or maybe it is opening the Bhagavad Gita, and which we can talk about, which may be challenging for people to read, but to see how it resonates with what's going on now, or a verse from there. So those are some of the ways I think we can begin.
One thing I hear you saying there is that, again, is a sort of path of knowledge, isn't it? I mean, to stop and turn in and to be present with how you're feeling. And like you say, all of these different techniques and styles and strategies that you get from, for instance, a yoga path, are ways of you getting in touch with what's going on right now. And again, that's knowledge, isn't it? You're learning about what your body was trying to say to you in that moment. And the degree to which you were ignoring it was the degree to which it was persistent in a way. Of course, I think avoidance strategies are real things, not always turning towards the hardest part. I don't think that's always a good strategy, especially if we're outside of our window of tolerance. But I love this, again, hearing you say, like, or at least I think I hear you say, coming back into touch so that you can know how it is for you. You can know what's going on in the body, and that knowledge is doing something special.
Yes, and it connects us to the collective body. Right. When I know myself better, right? When I am more connected, when I am striving to be in balance, even though I'm a human and am out of balance a lot of the time, even though I have this practice, but then I'm able to feel into my connection with everything. And I've only felt this. I felt it like one time. I was in a class and someone was leading it and she played some music and I heard the birds outside and I was like, oh, and then I felt like something that I'd never felt before. I don't know that I would call it bliss, but I felt this, like, I am connected to everyone. I'm not just this body right now. And it's important for me to recognize I'm in a human body because we are doing things to each other in a human body, but I had this moment of like, oh, this is it. This is the path. This is the practice. And that will change then how I relate to other beings and the planet.
It's so interesting you say that. I mean, people report that in all sorts of different contexts. So this was a big thing in the LSD movement of the 60s. It was brought to the West. And the thing everyone banged on about was, trust me, we're not separated. And that wasn't just an interesting observation. That was an observation that changed the way you then related to other people. And I've never heard it explicitly referenced to trauma, but it makes sense. Of course, if you're connected to a whole bunch of other people, the idea of individual trauma seems very strange, at least as separate to collective trauma. And I just wanted to bring in sort of one more piece here. You spoke about starting small. I think the nice bit about that advice is once you start small and you get a little bit of dopamine, like you see it work a little bit, you naturally want to do more, which is different to starting top down and going, it's 2 hours a day on the cushion. I think that's an important point to emphasize.
Yes, and it's people will, many of us will fall out of practice, right? Life is in session, things are happening, we become distracted. And when I do not sit and meditate for, my daily practice, I notice it. Even if I haven't done it for 2 days, I notice it because I've been doing it for a while now. And I notice I'm more irritable and just have a short fuse when I have not made time and space to sit and be with myself, to then think about how can I be with others, right? How can I relate to others? So I do think sometimes when people start with the 2 hours or even an hour, they fall out of practice. It's sort of more easily because they've started too big and it's not necessarily sustainable. We can build up to that though, for sure. And that may work for some people. I just, I've been conditioned to like start big, go big, all that. And I'm just not into it. I'm like, that's not sustainable for people. I don't actually want to burn out. I do want to engage in this practice and be devoted and on this path for the rest of my life. And that means I have to start small, right? In the way we've spoken about.
In the community where I teach meditation, we say the slow way is the fast way, because I'm a big type A personality, and early in my sort of meditative interest, I was the one who was going on super long retreats and living a super ascetic life. And it's all fine and well, but actually you run into more problems than not. And actually the slow, consistent, persistent, filled with self-love way ends up being the fastest possible way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's been my experience.
Shortcuts don't really exist. Just as we're talking about this, not just in this context, like I can't really think of it like, in work and relationships and spiritual practice, you miss steps and it feels great temporarily because look at my progress. But as you say, Mark, I think you cause more problems than not.
Yeah, you start kicking down doors because you can, consciousness doors, mind doors. And then you have to rebuild the door because you put yourself way outside of your window of tolerance. And then that takes longer than if you had have just relaxed, taken your time, found your edge, pulled back. We never do these things with physical exercise. Nobody goes to the gym and says, oh, I want to be bulky, so I'm going to start lifting 150 pounds today. Nobody does that. Everybody would shake their heads at that. Say, oh, that's crazy. Of course you wouldn't do that. You're going to hurt yourself. But when it comes to our minds, people are like, I'm going to start doing a meditation practice 2 hours a day. You think like it's exactly the same thing. It's relax.
It's the role of feedback though, right? Because if I try to pick up, I don't think I've ever stepped foot inside a gym. And if I tried to pick up a 150-pound weight, my back would let me know. I'd have the immediate feedback. But here, the feedback's delayed. It's like, it's only all the trouble you run into 6 months down the line, 3 months down the line, a month down the line. You don't have the initial, well, my back really hurts.
And the way you describe it, like there's disorientation and disorganization. Like it shifts everything around if people engage in that way, from what I understand. And there may not be the like net there to catch us, or the who am I? Like all of these things emerge rapidly, and people may not have the skills tools to respond to that kind of disorganization or disorientation.
So you've described yoga as being whitewashed, and I wanted to know what that felt like to interact with in your experience.
Yeah, so I think it connects with a couple of things. One is I've practiced yoga in the West, so this westernized version of yoga for the most part, and what that has meant is that many of my teachers, this has changed over the last several years, but many of my teachers, like when I went through teacher training, they were white individuals leading the space, holding the space. This is not always true based on where we are geographically, but in general, many of the yoga teachers that folks experience are not South Asian and are white. And when I entered my teacher training in 2009, I was a dismantling racism trainer, entered that teacher training, was thinking about the world and justice, and was an activist. And everything I heard about yoga philosophy felt like it was linked to activism, but we weren't actually talking about what was going on in the world or applying the philosophy to what was happening in our community, what we were doing to each other. And that didn't make sense to me. And I also then began to think about yoga as a path versus the industry of yoga, which feels whitewashed. The path doesn't necessarily feel whitewashed. What people have done with these practices, because they've been appropriated and taken, and in large part, people think about yoga as, are you going to yoga? And they mean, are you going to a movement class, right? Are you going to practice asana, which is just one path, and it's not the first limb of the 8-limb path even. And so the way that we think about yoga, the way we talk about yoga, the way yoga is taught feels whitewashed and feels like capitalism, that the industry of yoga, people took these practices People are profiting from the practices. People have created their own lineages of the practices that may be a profound departure from what the practice actually is. Not that I understand the path completely. I just want to name that. There's like so much I do not understand and so much I need to learn and know. So there's that piece. And what I saw being a dismantling racism trainer and activist is that the industry was replicating the same patterns that every other institution was creating and enacting, like exclusion of Black, Indigenous, people of color, bigger bodied people, trans people, non-binary people, elders. I rarely saw elders in the space, and the industry was upholding this idea that yoga is a practice for white, thin, cis, gender females between the age of 25 and I'd say 45 or 50 maybe. That's the image that was presented to me, has been presented to me, and continues to be. And so that is what I mean when I say whitewashed, that white supremacy and capitalism and all these other systems based on exclusion and supremacy met this practice, which is sacred, and didn't honor it in any way, or the place that it's from, where it originates.
Does that make it harder to get the fruits of the practice out?
Well, I think yes, because of who is controlling the narrative about what yoga is. Right? It will be from that frame and perspective. And what I saw is white folks are saying yoga is this and controlling the industry and being resourced from the industry, not just financially, spiritually resourced, and being uplifted and validated for being, which is what the culture does. It says white is normal and good and pure and right. And white-bodied folks should be teachers, right? And have the knowledge and wisdom, and are entitled to take parts of a practice without actually thinking about the entire path, and to repackage it and then sell it to people, including South Asian folks. Like, and this yoga is one example of appropriation, cultural appropriation, but it happens in so many ways, places, with so many practices and traditions. So I think in that way, if we think about who has controlled the narrative, who has been represented in spaces that call themselves yoga spaces, although I would say they may be exercise spaces, right? They may be something different than yoga if we think about the true path of yoga, that influences the experience people have as they enter into a space to practice yoga, or to go through a teacher training if they want to go through a teacher training, or to even hold space to practice with others. And I think the industry is, so the practice is the practice. I think the industry is shifting. I have seen a shift in the last few years. There's a lot, I mean, we have a long way to go for sure, but I've seen many South Asian Desi folks in a reclamation process around this practice, explicitly saying, this is our practice, right? And it was stolen, and look at how it's being practiced, and educating us, myself included, on what the path really is. And that's why I said my teachers, like who we choose to go to makes a difference. So to me, at some point in my teaching and just on the path, I sort of realized that I had thought about cultural appropriation because I learned it outside of the context of yoga. I learned it many years ago in a dismantling racism training, and then sort of thought about how it applied to everything we're doing and how it's hard not to appropriate given capitalism and where we are. But we still have a responsibility to think about accountability. And so I had a point where I was like, you are teaching yoga. This is not your direct lineage. It's not from your people, although Kemetic yoga is real. And so that is another conversation, but there were folks who look like me, who were practicing postures that look like some of the postures that people may associate with yoga from India. And the path that I learned was from India, not in the Kemetic tradition. And so I had this moment of like, you are profiting from a practice that is not yours. So you need to think about appropriations to the folks where this is from and where you learned this from. And then it entered into a conversation with some folks that I'm in relationship with who are South Asian about that. And I just think that's like that is my responsibility and important for us to think about, because also I know this practice is for everyone. And there have been teachers who are directly connected to the lineage who will say that. But if it's for everyone, how do we regard it and care for it and the people it's from?
Yeah, on the Kemetic yoga, we had a Yesa Rahotep on last week. And it was interesting because Kemetic yoga isn't something that we know a massive amount. Like the explanation you just gave would have 2 weeks ago been 100% of my knowledge about Kemetic yoga. And it's interesting, you just struck a balance there that I thought was interesting, because on the one hand, if the practices we assume are beneficial, and of course, South Asia makes up whatever percentage of the world's population, and you want as many people as possible to practice this thing, at some point you're going to have teachers and systems who are automatically, spontaneously non-South Asian. So there's this question of how to manage that given the context, to avoid kind of the ills of appropriation, while at the same time making sure the thing's accessible. Because the alternative is either total appropriation or just a totally inaccessible practice. How do you strike that balance?
Well, I thought about this a lot when I wrote the first edition of Skill in Action, and it was out in the world, and people were having an experience with it. And I thought about the amount of times that I'd entered into wellness spaces, yoga spaces, meditation practice spaces, and been the only Black person. And I thought, well, something is wrong with this picture, and what is it? And why is it this way when this practice is about unity and wholeness and our divine nature? Why aren't there more folks who look like me, or folks who are less proximal to power in this space? So I recognized the accessibility issue right away, not just based on race, on many identities. And that made me curious. And it also made me realize I had a story to tell about exclusion within this practice that is about wellness and wholeness, which feels different than the system of healthcare. When I interact with the system of healthcare in not holistic health, traditional healthcare, Western healthcare, my experience has been that that system is not designed to take care of me. But yoga is this practice that is a practice that supports me in caring for myself and others. And so it's different as an industry and system than healthcare or housing or banking, which in America was like never designed to care for Black people, right? We were always, we were set up to be behind. It was an inequitable, unjust system to begin with, but yoga is not that. So I was like confounded. I'm being presented this liberatory practice, and yet there are folks who can't be here. What is that? And that dissonance is what led to Skill in Action, and made me sort of realize I need to tell this part of the story. And so I told it based on my experience and based on race, but then generalized to other identities, and sort of tried to stay in my lane to amplify a conversation about how exclusionary the industry has been, and in so many ways continues to be, to raise consciousness about that. So I think the balance is like, I was clear about, I'm telling this part of the story, and it's just one part. It's not the full story, and it needs to be told.
Yeah, and the proximity to power thing is where you bring in the access and the intersectionality, because it clearly changes the dynamic of a room. If there's just it's the proximity to power point that hits home for me as, yeah, that's why it matters. It's not like, well, it's South Asian and therefore it would be aesthetic to have South Asian representation. It's not that. It's an access point. And an ability to flourish in the space, which, as you say, is important, because compared to your experiences with traditional healthcare, this should be quote unquote a space that you have more access, that you feel as if is more equitable.
Yes, it created a lot of dissonance for me. And, the amount of teachers who would say, breathe deeply and you can feel free to be yourself here and all this. And I'm like, well, for this 45 minutes, this teacher's inviting me to feel free. And I'm going to go out of this door in a Black body in a white supremacy culture that doesn't want me to be free at all. Like, that created a lot of physical, emotional, it just created curiosity and questions. And like, I need to say something about this experience. So how do we actually make this more liberatory? And what you're speaking about is make it more accessible. Be clear about our location, our social location, and our proximity to power and our agency. Be clear about reparations and our responsibility if we're practicing something that is not directly connected to our lineage. right? Be clear about who's missing in the room and why. Like, ask these questions, which is what I do as part of my practice.
So I want to move it now to the Bhagavad Gita. Obviously, I say obviously, I've learned it this week, one of the holy scriptures of Hinduism. How has it helped direct your work?
I love the Bhagavad Gita and have studied the text for probably about 10 years and go to it almost every day. And it's the kind of text that, in my experience, you can read over and over because the wisdom is so rich and deep. And I think that it resonated. The two texts that people will talk about often are the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. And often people have a preference for one or the other. And for years, I've been working with Bhagavad Gita, and I've just recently gone back to the Yoga Sutras more actively because I'm going to write a book about the kleshas, and have been teaching them, but have just been called to revisit the Yoga Sutras. And both are really, they're texts that I would recommend, even if you're not a yoga practitioner or teacher, reading, because they relate to what we are experiencing now, what we have experienced as well, the past. What resonated so deeply from the Bhagavad Gita is it is about many things, but the sort of short version is that it is about a warrior who has a responsibility to fight a war. And it is about dharma, what our duty is. So his dharma was to fight this war. And he doesn't want to fight it because he's fighting people that he knows. Now, there's a whole backstory of how they got to the battlefield, which is quite interesting and relates to polarization and like what we've experienced in our world, and separation and envy and greed and jealousy. It's like, it relates to all of these systems of oppression. That may not have been the intention of the Bhagavad Gita, but as I read how they actually got to the battlefield, I was like, oh, this family split for these reasons. And there was trickery that happened. And there was a family that was seen as pure and a family that was seen as evil. Like there's so much in there. But the essence is like, Arjuna, the warrior, being guided by Krishna, God, to lean into his dharma, his duty, and to work through all of the things, the grief, the mind stuff, the misalignment, which can happen around what we think, what we say, and what we do, to work through all of that, to end up, ultimately, Arjuna makes the choice. Krishna gives him he says, do as you wish, like you decide. I've equipped you with these practices. I've equipped you with knowledge about your dharma. I've equipped you with information about what to do when you notice resistance to this. I've equipped you with, or I've reminded you that your soul is everlasting. And so what you're doing in this moment is all part of my cosmic plan anyway. So go do this thing because it's what you're meant to do right now. He teaches about, we can't practice someone else's dharma. We don't all have the same work, and we'll suffer if we try to practice someone else's dharma. So part of our work is to get clear about what our dharma is and to live into that for the greater good. In the Gita, it's talked about as in service of God. Everything is in service of God or spirit or Krishna. And often I'll talk about it in that way, and also in service of the greater good, the collective good, because the other lesson that we already spoke about today is that we are divine beings and our true nature is divine. And Krishna teaches Arjuna to see the divinity in everyone and everything. And what would our world be like if we practice that? So there's so much more, but like those are like three of the highlights from the Bhagavad Gita, because it's just so deep and so relevant. And it's an explanation of like what we can practice, and what can come from that, and how we can be, and what does it mean to be devoted to something bigger. And again, it's God in the Gita, but what does it mean to be devoted to something bigger outside of yourself? Which is like, I'll be thinking about that for the rest of my life, right? So that's a little about the Gita and the resonance there. And you can tell I love talking about it because, yes.
Mark, is it something that you've run into formally in your practice?
Bhagavad Gita.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. I studied yoga for a long time in India. And that's one of the central texts. And I agree. I took loads from it. I think it's one of these books you can just read again and again and again. And the lessons are deep. And the same sort of thing I found, maybe we all find this face, I think, if you really engage with it earnestly, is that it tells a story that's archetypal. It's a story we all know because it talks about the root of the problem. And then it tries to offer some antidotes to that deep problem. So yeah, absolutely.
Michelle, before we finish up, where can everybody find you? And what of yours might they read that would be practically useful for them?
Yeah, so people can find me on my website, which is michellecjohnson.com. It's updated often with new workshops, immersions, events, and different articles and interviews there, and links to both of my books that are out now are on that site too. So that's the easiest way to stay in touch. I'm also on social media as Skill in Action, which is the title of my first book. And, folks are interested in, really all of what we talked about today. Both Skill in Action, the second edition came out in November of 2021. And even if folks read the first edition, the second edition is I think much better and more comprehensive. And I just say that because I wrote what I wrote in the first edition. I was like, this is what I have to say right now. And then of course we evolved, and I interacted with people and had conversations with them about this, many, many people. And it turned into a second edition that's much more comprehensive and is a reflection of my own study and deepening my practice. And I love it because it's just reflective of what we do as humans, right? We evolve over time. So Skill in Action, the second edition is you can find it through the site. And Finding Refuge, which came out in July of 2021, is about collective grief. And a lot of what we talked about related to trauma and spiritual practice. And both books have practices at the end of each chapter. They're meant to be text for us to go back to and practice over and over. And Finding Refuge is about heartbreak. And so how do we work with the heart, respond to the heart? So those two books, and then I'll have another book coming out, but it won't be until next April. And it's all about healing together, and how we heal together, and rituals for healing together, and thinking about our divine connection. So I'm excited about that.
Michelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be in conversation with y'all.
So that was Michelle Cassandra Johnson. This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. And thank you for listening. And as always, we'll see you next week.